All right, well, let's dive in here. We are talking about donor psychology, which is just another way to say people. We're going to talk about people and how to effectively steward our donors and our major donors and everybody else. And before we do that, just want to say happy Valentine's Day to everybody. Happy Black History Month. Looking forward to a long weekend next weekend for many people. Looking forward to warmer weather for a lot of folks. But just so glad to get to spend some time with you and really just acutely grateful that you're here. A couple of small things we do to say thank you. One is my colleague Simone, who is the best, makes sure that this is eligible for CFRE credits for your professional development. At the end of the session, we will drop a survey in the chat. You will fill that out. That will help us keep records. We don't send you a certificate or anything, but we're here in case you get audited. So that's CFRE. So let's dive in. Here's the agenda, very straightforward. Why is this important? What's sort of changing in stewardship generally? And what should we do about it? That's pretty simple. We will send the recording and the slides to you later today. Usually takes us a couple hours to sort of process everything, get it up to YouTube. So if you want to take notes, do it. If you want to sit back and hang out and sort of relax your shoulders and not type away, feel free to do that as well. All right, quick intros. My name is Patrick. I've met many of you in person, or at least remotely. I'm lucky to be the co-CEO of a company called FreeWill alongside Jenny, who's just wonderful. And then we are really delighted to work alongside 150 diverse, brilliant, lovely people at the FreeWill team. And we're so close to hitting $5 billion in money raised and committed to charity. So we think a lot about the sort of transformational gifts and different giving types and making those super easy for donors and for nonprofits. So a lot of the research and sort of the thought that you'll see in the next hour comes from a lot of different people on the team and not just me, obviously. Oh, and one other thing we want to do to say thank you. Sometimes we like to give away books. We've given this book away a few times, but we can give it away to 20 people each time. So you probably haven't won it yet, just based on math. We're going to send a copy of this book called Connect, which is Building Exceptional Relationships, Family and Friends, to 20 people. It is an amazing book and people rave about it when they get it. It's actually based on the most popular class at Stanford Business School, which is a grad school where I went to and met Jenny there. This class is called Interpersonal Dynamics. Everyone calls it touchy-feely. It's really just about human emotions and human interactions, but it's a really thoughtful book by Carol Robin and David Bradford. If you would like a copy, make a note in the survey, and then we'll send to 20 random folks. Okay, so how's your week going? Some good news and bad news here. Generally, happiness is staying level, although a little bit lower than perhaps this past summer, when we looked like maybe we were out of the woods on COVID in particular. And then we asked you how confident you are about hitting your goals this year. And what's happened in the last 2 weeks? Well, it's gone down a bit. Now this, 392, keep in mind that this graph is zoomed in, right? So don't be fooled too much by the scale. But we're starting to see a lot of stock market fluctuations, partly driven by macro world events, right? There's sort of deep uncertainty as to whether Russia will invade Ukraine. That is creating instability in the markets. Instability in the markets and sort of the stock market tends to be the #1 indicator of overall philanthropy in the course of a year. And so there's a little bit lower confidence, but it's not wildly shifted. So just want to note that compared to 2 weeks ago. All right, so that's a little bit of background on me, on you, on FreeWill. Really excited to dive into stewardship and why it's so important. Stewardship is sort of the most important, least sexy part of philanthropy. And many of you can probably relate. It doesn't really get headlines because it's sort of the quiet background work, but it's unbelievably important. We asked you, what are the 3 words you would describe to think about stewardship? And here's what you said, right? Things like relationship, gratitude, engaging, important, impact, vital, care, listening, necessary. You saw things like, sometimes you also did words like long and challenging, long-term, but really, I think people get it. And then the question of prioritizing it is a different question. When we ask people how you define stewardship, most of you said thanking a donor, cultivating a donor for a major gift, confirming a gift, adding them to a giving society, and then a bunch of other folks had other ideas. So when we're talking about stewardship today, there's a bunch of different meanings, and so let's just be clear on the vocabulary we're using. We think of it as a relationship building process after a donor has already made at least one gift. In this webinar, we'll be specifically talking about stewardship for planned gifts and for major gifts. We'll talk about a couple of the specific those, but major and planned gifts tend to be a little bit different than your sort of $10, $20 mail donors or your online donors. Mail, by the way, M-A-I-L, not gender. We'll actually talk about the difference between male and female philanthropists in an upcoming webinar. And it's difficult to overstate the importance of this, right? It costs vastly more to acquire new donors than retain them. Recurring donors give significantly more than one-time donors. Each gift, right? We don't just mean multiplying it because they're giving more. Each gift. And when you can get a donor to give a second time, they're much more likely to give a third, fourth, fifth, etc. This means that more gifts and more money for your organization without added costs in the work of acquisition. And so it should always be easier to get another gift from the same donor than to get a new donor. And then it's always easier to sort of grow the gift size of that donor than it is to get new donors. How does it impact planned giving? One of the things that's really, really interesting about planned giving is that research by our friend Dr. Russell James out at Texas Tech, deep in West Texas in Lubbock, shows that people who make planned gifts then increase their annual giving by 75%. Obviously, a ton of work also goes into cultivating major donor relationships. And so these are the folks that you'll eventually turn into planned giving donors as well. You probably don't need to be reminded, but the average planned gift is just astronomically larger than anything else that people are giving. When we ask you what percentage of your major donors make a second gift, now that big light blue in the top right, that's people that don't know. So it's okay if you didn't know when you're filling out the survey, but you can see that almost 20% of folks said, oh, only between 1 1/4 of our major donors make a second gift, right? That's sort of 76 to 100%. That's where we all want to be. Only 15% of folks are there yet, right? So if you're struggling with this, you're obviously not alone. It's a real big challenge for a lot of folks, but it is going to be one of the biggest things you can do to hit your goals. We also asked what percentage of your major donors, right, people that have shown a deep affinity to your organization, make a planned gift. And again, a lot of people don't know, so that's okay. You can sort of forget about that top blue part. But 10% say none, and 35% say 1 to 25, right? So very small percentage, and this is a massive opportunity, right? Remember that we're going into what we call the great wealth transfer. Now, many of you know this like the back of your hand, but some of you don't. In the next 2 decades, there will be about $70 trillion passed on as baby boomers age. Baby boomers are the largest and wealthiest population in the history of the United States. There are more millennials than boomers now because some of the boomers have passed away already, but in terms of births, largest. And they control roughly half the assets of the United States. And so planned giving from this generation is incredibly important and will fund your organization for decades to come. So this is going to be extremely important. We asked about what percentage of your coming back, what are your planned giving donors? Do they make annual or major gifts? And very few said, no, none of them do. In fact, 14%, second highest said 76 to 100%. So what we saw in that Russell James research, once you get a planned gift, that person becomes a donor ongoingly. That's really good news. And so it's actually sort of inverts the donor pyramid a bit, and that's really important. What are the 3 barriers to successful stewardship for folks? Everybody says not enough time, which is a fair barrier for a lot of folks. And so we're going to talk about what are some of the simple things you can do that are either not that much time or some things that are set it and forget it, right? Get this thing going, and then it'll just happen for the rest of the next few years. 42% is the lack of a stewardship plan. Only 16% of the team doesn't understand the value of stewardship, and some other things as well. So let's talk about some trends that are affecting stewardship. Why is this important? Why has it gotten sort of hard recently? Right? So one of the things is that stewardship has actually gotten harder in the last 5 years. Let's talk about why that is. So the biggest thing we're seeing is a rise in what we call unintentional anonymous giving. Now, what we mean here is giving types and the way that people are giving is changing pretty dramatically, and that's having unexpected and unintended consequences for stewardship. So in the last few years, for instance, qualified charitable distributions, these are also known as IRA charitable rollovers. I think most of you know what they are. If you don't, enter in the chat and we'll do some more explaining. These have more than tripled, right? So this is one of the fastest growing types of giving in the United States. Nearly a quarter of nonprofits say that a lack of donor information is one of their biggest challenges around these types of gifts. IRA custodians, right, remember these are gifts that come from your retirement account directly to the charity. So they never come from the donor. They often don't include donor information on checks. They often don't even specify that this is a qualified charitable distribution, which is really important because these things need different tax receipts or different kinds of receipts. And so there's no way to thank donors. Now, one of the problems here is that IRA charitable rollovers, or QCDs, tend to be enormous. They average $10,000 compared to a typical cash gift of about $100. So they're 100 times larger. For many people, they will be the biggest type of gift anyone ever gets or they ever give, and then they hear crickets from you, and that's really frustrating. Meredith asks, how are receipts different for QCDs and a traditional gift? Just to answer that very quickly, because I know I alluded to it. QCDs are really, really special because they're the only way for older Americans to give pre-tax dollars, right? So that money went into an IRA, never taxed, is growing tax-free, and then when you take distributions from your IRA or your 401k, you have to pay income tax on it, right? That's sort of how the legal structure is set up. You can avoid paying that tax by sending that money directly to a charity, which doesn't have to pay income tax. And so you have all this pre-tax money, which you can give, and then you can conserve your post-tax money. What does it mean from a receiving standpoint? It means that what you have to do is say thank you, not your gift is tax deductible. Because the gift is not tax deductible, they've never paid taxes on it in the first place. So really, really important. Giving from donor-advised funds are also rising nearly 20% per year. Nonprofits say that 15 to 20% of DAF gifts, donor-advised fund gifts, also come without donor information. Donors go unthanked, don't receive the right acknowledgements, also a different tax acknowledgement, by the way, and become angry and disillusioned. This is fairly common with stock gifts as well. Stocks will get transferred. Now, stocks are even larger on average than qualified charitable distributions. Brokers don't send over the information. So what's happening is you have all these people who end up as anonymous donors but don't know they're being anonymous. They've never asked for it, right? It's not as though you sort of don't, they're not trying to hide and you want to uncover them. There's no mystery to solve here. They never knew that the funds would arrive to you without their name attached. And now they're sitting here twiddling their thumbs, waiting for a thank you, waiting for acknowledgement of this tremendous impact they've had, and nothing happens. Right? So this is a real problem. Not being able to even talk to these folks is one of the biggest challenges in modern stewardship, even though it's outside what we traditionally think of as stewardship. If you can't even send a basic thank you note to these folks, boy, they're not going to give again, or they're going to be pretty frustrated. Certain groups are even more likely to give anonymously. Higher asset individuals, older generations, men are slightly more anonymous than women, and these donor groups often give the biggest gifts. So we'll talk about how to solve anonymity in the next section. Other things to note here, certain demographics, as I mentioned. So when we're looking at bequest data, right? So people that are making wills through FreeWill, leaving gifts, the number of people sharing information actually goes pretty straight down as we get older. So we need to put extra focus here on older donors. Gen Z, Zillennials, which is sort of thought of as younger millennials, Oregon Trail millennials. If you sat through the webinar on millennial giving, we went really deep into how Oregon Trail millennials are different. Really special group, also proud to be part of it. Gen X, Boomers, and Silent Generation. Also, in terms of anonymity by cause area, it varies a little bit. So things like family and foster care, community, environmental tend to be the lowest. Humanitarian orgs tend to be the highest. Housing and shelter tend to be higher. Why is that? We think because some of the sort of stuff on the left is a little bit more at the national level. And so people are less likely to have a one-to-one relationship with you and a little bit uncertain around sort of what kind of marketing is going to happen compared to more community organizations where they sort of know a person individually. All right, trend number 2. So first one, unintended anonymity. We'll talk about how to solve this in a second. Super, super, super important. Second is that donor retention is decreasing. In the latest fundraising effectiveness report, I believe this was from Indiana School at Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. There's also been a small decrease in dollars coupled with a small decrease in the number, increase in dollars, decrease in the number of donors, what it means is that your big donors are getting even more important, and people are struggling to retain those smaller donors. This is really a big challenge. So year over year, the number of donors went down, the number of dollars went up, and retention went way down. So there's a lot to unpack here, but it's really important that we understand it. Okay, so that's second trend. We'll talk more about how to solve that in a second. And the third is just, look, there's been a historic and massive shift towards non-cash giving that by all intents and purposes looks to continue almost indefinitely. So you can see, these are through our stock tools, the number of stock gifts created by week, and the massive shift towards non-cash end of year 2021 compared to end of year 2020. Qualified charitable distributions, the massive shift in 2021, end of 2021 compared to 2020 and 2019. So really, really, really important here. There's a massive move towards planned giving as well. So you can see over the years how this goes. That August, that sort of giant spike, by the way, is around August, which is Make-A-Will month. We'll talk about that in a different session. But you're seeing a huge increase in giving through bequests and planned giving. Why is that happening? Probably a couple trends. One, America is getting older, right? So there are more 75-year-olds than ever before. There are more 77-year-olds. There are more 73-year-olds. Those folks are really thinking about estate planning. Two, estate planning is getting better, right? It's more and more of it's moving online, and including for older donors, and it's becoming more accessible. And then three, there's just been a ton of focus, partly by FreeWill, frankly, but also by a lot of other folks, to really amp up planned giving, because this sort of once in a lifetime opportunity of the great wealth transfer is going to be so important in philanthropy. All right, so that is a lot to cover in terms of big trends. Let's talk about what to do about them. So first things first, let's end the anonymous donor problem, and here's how to think about it. The best thing we can do for better stewardship is to not have anonymous donors to begin with. This will improve your stewardship by about 25% overnight when we can implement it. You can't steward, you can't thank these donors, they'll be less likely to give again. They'll also have a somewhat negative opinion of your organization because, boy, this gift was really big, it sort of hurt to give, but it felt really important, and then zero acknowledgement. And so in terms of word of mouth, may not be very positive. Really, really important to get this right. Two big things you need to do to uncover them. One is fixing your website. We'll talk about that in a second. And then two is making sure we're giving people a reason to share info, right? People are inclined to help us, right? That's why they just made this massive donation to your organization. So they're predisposed to helping you, but we have to ask for that help. We have to give reasons why it's important. So for stocks, qualified charitable distributions, bequests, donor information, crypto giving, which is becoming massively important. I don't know if folks saw the Super Bowl. There were 3 different ads about crypto, and the news reports said that 20 million people tried to download the Coinbase app, which is for trading crypto, during the Super Bowl, and it crashed the site after Coinbase went to number 2 on the App Store. So really interesting stuff there. Gift officers can then follow up with in-process gifts, meaning if someone submits that, hey, I gave you a stock gift, but then you don't see that stock gift go through, it's really important that we can follow up and say, I saw you tried to give 200 shares of Apple. It's worth a lot of money. Did you encounter some hurdles? What can we do to help? And that's a really valuable piece. And just delays. So there's some other things here as well. Let me sort of be super clear about what we mean here before I move on. What you really want to do is, for instance, like your broker information, or the EIN or something for QCDs, you want to have someone fill out a form before you show that, so you can make sure you're tracking all this information. To uncover donors who already made gifts and are anonymous, make sure you're giving them a way to notify you of their gift. This means making it really easy to find a gift notification form on your website, and you might want to place a form like this on your most trafficked pages, a donate page, a home page, etc. Think about what is the cost of losing one of these donors for the next 5 years because we didn't get to thank them in the first place. It's really, really important that we make sure that people can see it. So as an example, the University of Cincinnati Foundation, they give you a reason here. You can request a tax acknowledgement letter for your qualified charitable distribution. Again, it's not quite the same as a normal tax receipt, but useful to have. And so you can go to the website, and this is quite prominent. You can see it. The second thing we want to note here is giving reasons. And those of you that joined our writing session heard about this study, but it's one of the best ones we've seen. When you ask for a favor, you ask for anything, you'll be much more successful when you provide a very clear reason after the fact. As an example, we really like to just tell people it makes your work as a nonprofit easier and helps support your cause by us not having to track down your info. Or because you might need to get a tax acknowledgement letter. There's a very famous study that we've talked about in the past by Professor Langer over at Harvard in 1977. Here's what happens basically. So it's 1977, Harvard Faculty Lounge, and they're running a study. And they run a study with grad students because there's plenty of grad students. And there's a line at the copy machine all the time. Those of you that worked in the 70s or 80s or 90s, remember there's just a line at the copy machine constantly. And so they send the grad student says, excuse me, I have 5 pages, may I use the Xerox machine? And for those of you that are in that sort of millennial Gen Z, Xerox was the most famous copy machine brand. And 60% of people would say yes. And 40% of people said no, wait your turn. Then they said, okay, great. Let's give you a reason. Excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I'm in a rush? And suddenly only 6% of people said no, right? This sort of very relatively minor reason. But then the kicker here is that when they said, excuse me, I have 5 pages. May I use the Xerox machine because I need to make copies, which is the only reason you would use a Xerox machine, still all but 7% said yes. And so really the point here is giving any reason can be incredibly persuasive in a pretty remarkable degree. And so make sure that every time you're asking for something, it's followed up with a very clear reason as to why. All right, what else should we do? Let me preface this by saying planned giving struggles with anonymity to the largest degree by an order of magnitude. So historically, when we did a bunch of research about this, we were grad students, we looked and realized that between 20 and 25% of gifts in a will or a trust are known to the organization beforehand, which means 75 to 80% are anonymous. And this is remarkable because it cuts down on the ability to plan. You can't thank these donors, you can't steward them. Also, it means that planned giving is traditionally underinvested in because you don't know about gifts that are coming, and so it feels like a small thing until suddenly these gifts come out of the blue. We tried 7 different tests. We said, we're gonna fix this. And we failed, and we failed, and we failed, and we failed, and we failed. And then I think my colleagues Jada and Fred came up with this idea that we tried as our last effort, and it doubled the percentage of donors who agreed to share their info with a nonprofit. So what was the successful thing? Will you make the work of nonprofits easier by letting them know who you are? Anonymous gifts may be less helpful because they often cannot be included in planned giving goals. Now, this is so interesting because we're always taught, don't make it about me, the fundraiser. It's about the mission, it's about the impact. But people have this relationship and can really identify with you as an overworked professional trying to do your job, trying to live out the mission you're trying to serve. And it turns out this is incredibly persuasive. So you can always say, hey, it will make my job a lot easier if you do X. And then people think, oh, am I willing to make your job a lot easier? And the answer is almost always yes. And so this is a really big shift. It's really, really important that you sort of start to think about how do we use some of this language and the natural human tendencies in order to sort of dramatically shift your goal attainment and your ability to steward these folks because they're willing to help you, an individual person. So remember, older donors, wealthier donors, men tend to be more likely to be anonymous, but also these folks are on your supporter email list for the most part, right? That's how they knew about you and knew to give. And so you can start with outreach to these groups with an easy way to notify you and a reason to do so. I believe we have some sample emails for that as well. We can share after the fact. All right, a couple more tips for donor psychology and stewardship. I think most of you will know about Pavlov's dog. So let me know if you don't in the chat. But I'm probably going to bastardize this story a little bit. Pavlov, famous scientist, tried to understand conditioning, would ring a bell every time it was feeding time. And the dog would start salivating when the plate of food came. And eventually, because the bell was accompanied by the food, that Pavlov could ring the bell and the dog would start salivating even in the absence of food, because it was so heavily associated using what's called conditioning or conditioned stimulus. And so they're salivating immediately. Here it is shown to be a whistle. I believe the original experiment was with a bell. So someone can correct me if I'm wrong there. What does that mean? So are our donors dogs? No, they're not. But is conditioned stimulus a thing? You can see it in a lot of advertising. You can see it as a lot of, you sort of see beer commercials or chips and nachos and other things like that. Say, when you think party, think Bud Light. When you think family, think KFC. Whenever you're sort of thinking about this thing, they want you to associate it with this other thing so that you'll eventually buy it. All right, so stewardship is like this as well. You want your donors to remember you at really key moments when they decide to give. And one of the things that we think is most impactful here is keeping them in touch, educating them throughout the year on giving around IRAs and stocks, et cetera, even when you're not making an ask. So when you can talk about some of these other ways to give, it's unlikely that every time they think about cash, they'll think of you. There's just too many things associated with cash. But it can be the case that you can heavily associate yourself with IRAs, with stock giving, even with crypto. And so when people think about crypto, they think about donations and they think about you. When people think about stocks, when they check their portfolio, when they see capital gains in their portfolio, they think about you. And this is the type of conditioning that can really shift behavior over time and create sort of this really tight wiring in the brain between donations and this type of asset, which will result in dramatically larger gifts. Sometimes, by the way, solving donor retention is getting good at asking in multiple ways, so that every time they're thinking about this, we're doing it as well. Here's one example of how to think about this. You might send this note. Hi, Mark. I thought of you today because another longtime donor from California just made a gift of stock and was thrilled to save so much on her taxes while having a huge impact. Like many of our donors, she was surprised to learn how beneficial stock giving was for her and the impact she wants to have. I wanted to share this with you because I remember you mentioning how excited you were about the stock market this year. If you haven't thought about stock giving before, I hope this is helpful to you for any of your giving to our organization or elsewhere. This can help you save money and have a bigger impact on the causes you care about, right? So what is this doing? There's a bunch of information here. We're educating Mark, the donor. What we're really doing is saying, Mark, when you think about stocks, which you probably do somewhat regularly, but obviously not as much as you're thinking about dollars and coins and cash, think about donating. And as we start to have these conversations and share these messages, this is where that stimulus really, really kicks in. Before we get this, I think, so many of you are FreeWill partners. We're doing a partner-only training, I think tomorrow, to talk about a tax season campaign, particularly around stock giving. And why is this such a good idea? Many of you are participating and messaging about stocks around tax season. Now, it's not end of year giving, right? So your taxes, your 2021 taxes aren't going to get affected by something you give in April 2022. Certainly your April 2023 taxes will be affected. But what we're really doing is conditioning donors to think, oh, I think about taxes, I should think about giving. And I should think about some of the smartest ways to get. Stock is one of them, crypto, IRAs, all this stuff is really important. And people think about taxes somewhat regularly. And then also, so we're sort of building the condition and using the condition, right? Because people are already thinking about taxes right now, filing their taxes for April. That's going to be a trigger, a mental trigger, or a conditioned response in Pavlov's language in order to think about giving. And so this sort of symbiotic relationship is really, really important. Great. All right. So the other thing to think about stewardship is there's some real value here in thanking donors. Obviously you want to thank folks to a great degree you've given a certain amount, but obviously every donor is valuable. This will build trust in what people call the warm glow of feeling that inspired them to give in the first place. What is the warm glow? A University of Oregon study wanted to see if people gave out of a sense of altruism or if they gave to feel good. And each subject got $100. Some were taxed, money that would go to the food banks, and others had the choice to donate. On average, making a choice to donate produced a much stronger activation of the brain's pleasure center than taxation did. This isn't surprising. Many of you pay taxes and donate, and you can imagine, a lot of those taxes are used for super important purposes. And how often do you feel just totally great about paying sales tax versus your choice to give, right? So the donor is in the same place. Thanking the donors reminds them particularly of this choice and reactivates that feeling. If you can do only one thing after the donor gives, send them a thank you note, highly personalized for planned and major giving donors, obviously, and templated for small gifts. This will go a long way to improving retention. Before we get off this topic, it's really important to tell folks about thanking them not just for giving, but for making the choice to give, right? And the sort of emphasis of you had the freedom to give and you did it. That creates a sort of strong response because it builds up the donor as a type of person who gives and is altruistic. And the more that a lot of times this identity-based work is really important. Some of you are in sort of the vaguely political world. Some of you are in sort of get out the vote stuff. And one of the most interesting things about this is one of the highest impact ways to get people to vote is say, thank you for being a voter. Not thank you for voting. That's different. Thank you for voting is something anyone can do. Thank you for being a voter really builds my identity. So we're thinking about people making the choice to donate. Thank you for being a donor. Thank you for being someone who supports causes like this. And that really builds the warm glow. We've talked about this in our writing session, but it's really important. Getting extremely personalized in follow-ups is not as hard as we think. So there's something called the cocktail party effect, is when you can tune out other voices to focus on one auditory stream. A key trigger for tuning is hearing your own name. The cocktail party effect basically says, you're in a crowded room, I'm talking to a bunch of friends, maybe making conversations with people I don't like or really like, doesn't matter, in the cocktail. And then I can hear my own name in the corner. And suddenly my brain really picks that up, right? And that level of acute attention giving happens in donors as well. So we do this sometimes, but if you were born in 1980, 81, 82, you're sort of the youngest millennials, the oldest millennials, younger Gen Z, oldest millennials, youngest Gen X, common names of that time, Emily, Jennifer, Mark, Michael, Thomas, Samantha was sort of making an appearance around then. And if you are, if that is your name, you now are listening to the slide more closely. And so anyone in the sort of Jennifer, Thomas, Michael, Mark, Stephanie world, feel free to chime in if that's true. And other folks are going to be, not sort of attuned to the same thing. This is particularly true with the parts of social behavior and long-term memory. So the more that I use your name in this session, the more you will remember this very specific slide and point. Personalized experience also gives people a greater sense of control, reduces information overload. But it's not just about name. Obviously, we're using names, but that's sort of 101 at this point. Think about getting more specific. Remember to refer back to the donor information that they've shared with you. If you're a college, what class year? What was their favorite art? What was the personal action to a cause? What did it feel like? You know what dorm they lived in. Hey, remember your first day in Darnell Hall and what it was like to sort of encounter all these new students? Well, that's what a lot of our students are going through right now. And we'd love to help support that. You want to send progress updates for causes they previously donated to? This doesn't have to be hyper tied to their donation. It's often the mistake that people make. Just as an example, there's something great called the Heifer Foundation. They do amazing work. They grew from a $1 million annual organization to 100 million by helping people give very specifically to, a flock of sheep to this family, a series of ducks to this family, a cow, they'll provide milk and other things to this family. That's great. And it shows the power of it. Not everybody can be that, but you can say, last year, last September 16th, you gave this gift. I wanted to show you something that I helped to fund, even if it wasn't, all that money went to exactly this place. And that can be really, really useful. When people hear the stories of individuals rather than groups, so when you're doing these thank yous and being specific, they're much more likely to donate. This is called the identifiable victim effect. We don't really need to think about this in sort of victim sense, but that's just what the psychological term is. Presenting these statistics alongside an individual story actually decreases it. So when you say, you made a donation last November 16th, and it helped Mary, and now she's going to this college to major in this, thank you so much for helping people like Mary. That is really, really valuable and really, really potent. So think about starting to incorporate that as well. You can, by the way, share the same student story with lots of people because all these folks chipped into it. So it's not as though you need to sort of come up with 1,000 different student stories for 1,000 different donors. Okay, we love this thing called the thinking of you note. It is one of the highest impact things. It takes literally 1.5 minutes to type out. And it is, if you don't have time, think about writing 100 of these a month and you will do them really quickly. Note something specific this person has helped to fund. Share something you saw in action where the donation helped, preferably on an individual level. Keep it extremely short. Why short? A, you told us you're too busy. B, it will feel much more extemporaneous and spontaneous when you keep it very short. Here's a subject line, thinking of you. Now, again, put yourself just for a moment in the mind of the donor as we walk through this. You get a subject line, thinking of you. Do you open that or not? You almost certainly open it. Sean, this is your name in this situation, but you can put your own, say your own name out loud, put it in that. I walked by Sam on campus today, and she was explaining a geometry concept to another student, and I think doing a pretty good job. I know that the scholarship that you and Rachel funded is making a big difference to Sam, but I thought you'd like to know it seems to be helping the other kids too. Have a great day, Patrick. That's the whole note. This took me 45 seconds to type, probably 1.5 minutes to come up with, and you can imagine the impact this gets out of the blue, right? So Sean is going to go home, talk to his spouse, Rachel, in this context, share it. Wow, this is so cool. We feel really great. That warm glow that we talked about, only thing to make this better, maybe say the scholarship you and Rachel funded, last October or something else is making a big difference. But this sort of specificity really hits home. You can really, and this is only 50 words, maybe 60 words, you can picture everything that's happening, especially if you went to that school, right? You have at least some sort of scene in mind, and it really hits home to a huge degree. Mary says she's crying, but hopefully it doesn't have that strong an impact. And James asks, do you want consent? Yes, obviously you'd want to ask that as well. You can also do it as a text message. Text messages feel even more spontaneous than emails do, and again, can be super quick. So, hi Joanna, Patrick from the Land Trust here. I thought of you today because I was walking out this morning, saw a brother and sister, maybe 4 and 6, just delighting in the daffodils in the new reserve we just opened. Their mom and dad seemed to love being outside. The kids seemed like they didn't usually get to spend this much time among wildflowers. I know you helped to fund this expansion we did last August, and I wanted to make sure you knew the joy that you were making possible. Thanks for being such a generous person, and here's my favorite flower I came across today. Right, there's a little butterfly on it. Good photo. This is probably a minute of texting, right? Maybe 1.5 minutes. You can imagine getting this out of the blue. You're in a meeting, you're doing other stuff. What a delightful experience to get this. And it sort of feels like a love note in a really sort of healthy and positive professional way. And so this stuff really, really kicks in. And Stephanie asks, ideas of thinking of you with general donors. Let's say that, in this scenario, it doesn't have to be the case that they think about having funded the expansion specifically, right? You could say your donation helped to fund the expansion last August of this, and I thought you'd want to know, right? Because things that in the general fund that are then allocated here can play a role. And so it's not that everything has to be hyper earmarked for you to say thank you about a specific thing. And that's one of the really big lessons I want you to take away from this, right? So there are plenty of charities that I give to, and I almost always sort of give to the general operating fund or the general fund because I trust that they're going to do the most good. Many donors like more specificity, but I sort of have seen inside enough nonprofits to try to make it as easy as possible for them. With that donation, you can still thank me for something specific that the organization is doing, rather than giving me this sort of like pie chart annual report that feels cool, but also a little bit more like sort of a financial statement. All right. And Yolanda says, love the image at the end. Agree. Some other thoughtful ways that we heard from you all before we get to some questions and answers and next steps. SUNY New Paltz up in New York State created a highly researched scholarship book for a major donor. Now, this is going above and beyond, but here's the story. Our donor, who is not an alum, pretty remarkable, had established an endowed scholarship memorializing his mother. With the help of an intern, we uncovered the names and interests of his aunts who also intended. He created, right, this is the specificity we're talking about. He created a bequest intention that increased the scholarship 5-fold. We then invited him to campus to present remarks at the scholarship reception, yielded another gift. This has been so fun watching the connection to our college develop, right? The sort of specificity, the individual stories, the human interaction. None of this is, boy, we increased our graduation rates by 4% this year, which, by the way, is awesome if you did that. It's not what's actually going to connect to that degree. Because we are a food bank, here's another example, we can easily engage the donors through stewardship of their gift, through providing a volunteer experience, connecting those who have benefited, lived experience with hunger, and providing tours or a ride along on one of our trucks making deliveries. Now, what happens here, it's not that they go to sort of see the massive thing. They remember serving food to one person. They remember the sort of look on someone's face with one delivery, and that one-to-one connection is what's going to drive ongoing giving. Another idea from the community, donate to their causes. When someone has a fundraising page for, say, a walkathon, we participate alongside them in activities they enjoy, et cetera. So this is a major giving officer talking about how they interact with the donor. And so they make small donations to their cause. Now, obviously, they don't have the same sort of potentially same assets that the major donor has, but chipping in $15, right? Going on a walk, going to a yoga class with them, boy, that's obviously game changing. And so if you can do that for your highest level donors, that's really amazing, and what a cool idea. Someone from a college says, we send professors books to the donors when the passions align. We frame old college yearbook photos of the donor to surprise the alumni family at a college visit, right? So they come, right? They're coming for a reunion, and you get to present them with this old college yearbook photo. How cool is that? And they ask for prayer requests alongside donations to really personalize and drive that home. Obviously, there's some places that's appropriate for and some places not. And when we bring a keynote speaker for the annual Foundation of Faith event, I pick a couple to pick that person up, take them everywhere, get them back to the airport. The donors feel special, and so does our guest. It is work to build bridges and relationships. I want to highlight something here that's really important. Oftentimes, people think stewardship is about thanking people. Sometimes it can be for asking for more. Hey, this was so great. You're so connected. Can you do this other thing, right? Not always more cash or more giving. Can you pick them up? Can you volunteer? Can you help welcome, some of our new folks to the shelter? Things like that will really, really build you. All right, so those are some great examples from you all. Thank you to everyone who sent those in, and a bunch of great ones that we weren't able to feature because of time, but pretty remarkable what you guys are doing as a sector, and awesome to see. A couple reminders. So my colleague Simone, again, she's the best, is going to paste in the chat, right? Thank you, Simone, right now on target. This survey is super helpful to us, and we're really grateful when people fill it out. Most people on the call tend to do it. And it helps us really learn about what's going well, what isn't, and that's sort of what has made these quite useful. It also is where we go through ideas on what to present on the future and do a bunch of research. So it will be really helpful to us. It's also really helpful to the rest of the community when you can fill that out. It takes about 45 seconds. So if you don't mind, please do that right now. In the survey also, you'll be able to put in your name and address for this book. Please don't forget your address, otherwise we can't send it to you. A couple other things, Sanford donor cultivation and a sample stewardship plan. Many of you said the lack of a plan was the reason you weren't doing well with this. And so our team has put a lot of effort and love into making that great for you. We're also sharing a case study from the American Heart Association, who those guys do lights out work and are really best in class at it. So delighted to share that as well. Thank you, by the way. I don't know if folks from AHA are on the call, but for participating in that and sort of sharing your learnings and your best practices. That is so cool. And then, just very quickly to pitch the team that all the amazing hard work going on behind the scenes at FreeWill. There are some really great tools that our team has worked on around stock giving, which not only solve the anonymous giving problem, but also generate way more gifts from the donors. Same tools around qualified charitable distributions, fastest growing type of philanthropy. Our Will tool is closing in on $5 billion raised for charity, which is awesome. And so this, by the way, cool news, the FreeWill estate planning tool is the #1 estate planning tool in America right now, past LegalZoom. So that's pretty exciting and pretty wild, and generating just literally $4, $5, $6 million every day in new bequests. So we're thrilled about that. And then more recently, we have been helping tons and tons of nonprofits take crypto and navigate the world of crypto donations. And that's been super fun, and we're learning a ton together. And so Crypto Tool actually has no upfront cost at all. So if you want to sign up for that, please do so in the survey. Okay, a couple quick notes. On Thursday, I'm going to do a super deep dive on crypto philanthropy and a demonstration of a custom crypto site. So if you want to join that noon on Thursday, just leave a note in the survey. Also, my colleague Alyssa, who is so smart and so thoughtful, is doing a session on how lots of nonprofits are using planned and major giving tools with some case studies. If you want to join that, also great use of time. It's on 3 o'clock on Thursday. So we're going to take a very quick break here. I'm going to go through all the questions you asked. We had a lot of questions. I'll figure out what sort of had some recurring themes. If you can use this 30 seconds to take that survey, it would be so great. And then we'll come back and do questions. All right, so some really thoughtful questions in here. Drea asks, what language would you use to try to justify to a supervisor that looking deeper into anonymous gifts could be beneficial when the supervisor is not really willing to have that conversation? And I think I would frame it in the interest of the donor. Say, hey, Supervisor X, what we've realized, and maybe we learned it in this recent webinar, that a lot of these donors aren't actually intending to be anonymous. And so people that are really interested in being thanked and more deeply included with us are sort of, we're letting them down a little bit. And being able to make sure that we're reaching out to these folks, thanking them, but also help them give future gifts is going to be really important. And I know that we have this goal this year, right? Let's call it, $1 million in revenue or 10 million in revenue or 100 million in revenue, depending on your organization. This might be a really good avenue to do that. So maybe we can do a little bit of experimentation and spend a limited amount of time to see if we get any traction there. So that's how I would think about it. Mandy says, I find it hard to determine whether when donors intend to be anonymous or are unintentionally anonymous. How hard should I try to find their contact info if they didn't mean for me to have it? Mandy, I think a good rule of thumb here is if it's cash or credit card or something else, it tends to be a little bit harder to be anonymous. You can and they've made some effort to make it anonymous. Let's call that intentional. The giving types, right? When things are coming, especially from a brokerage, right? A stock brokerage, or one of these Fidelity retirement accounts or Fidelity DAF, that's where your ears should perk up and say, oh, this probably didn't mean to be anonymous. And so when we talk to donors, by the way, a lot to sort of learn more about this, and extremely few say, oh boy, I really want to hide my identity. And it's much more unintentional. And so I would say, use that sort of conditioning of, oh, does this look like a QCD? Does this look like a DAF gift? Does this look like a stock gift? Maybe not intentional, maybe not intentionally anonymous. So that's how I would think about differentiation. Dawn says we get very little info when the donations come through Schwab or Fidelity, so it can be sometimes hard to connect the dots. Any idea how to ensure we can get the right gifts when we only have a name or attribute the gifts? This is where we think on your website, there should be clear instructions about how to give a DAF, how to give a stock gift, and make it extremely clear that you're not going to get donor information. The tools that I showed you in the last few slides, people use because they're really super clear about that. And they can help guide a donor through a stock process in a way that also collects all donor information. So that's one idea for you. Logan has a good question. Says, are you seeing stock giving slow down or concerns from donors with inflation rising? How do you address these concerns from donors, or donors suggesting they're going to wait until the market gets better before sending their major stock gift? So there's two thoughts here. One is, what do we actually do about inflation? If I was running a major or planned or overall advancement team right now, and inflation seems to continue, which likely, right? So January's inflation numbers, highest on record. I would say the last thing we should be doing is taking cash donations, right? We should be, because that someone's giving me $100 because they think, oh, $100 is a lot of money. And that $100 is actually less valuable every year, every month at this point. So that's really important. Focusing on some of the gifts that are rising, retirement accounts, stock giving, donor advised funds is a really important sort of macro strategic point when we think about inflation, right? Money is the worst thing during inflation because it's worth less. Also means things like planned gifts. We really want to be focused on percentage gifts because that will go up over time versus a fixed amount. Someone might be writing into their will for $50,000 right now. That feels really generous to them, and it is. But in 10 years, maybe it's not going to sort of go as far as they thought it might. So that's important. In terms of waiting until the market gets better, this is where giving a really clear reason makes sense. Saying, oh, we could wait, but we're really looking forward to helping fund this thing that we're doing in April, right? And explain what the thing is and explain it with a sort of a personal context. And then suddenly we've made sense. If the donor thinks that you are indifferent about getting money in September versus getting money in July, then you haven't really given them a reason to speed it up. And so making sure that we're very clear on why money earlier is better is quite useful. Ed says, do some donors not appreciate a text message out of the blue? Ed, we haven't seen that at all. People tend to be thrilled with it. And I think people know when it's sent from a person versus sort of a mass text. So I think, if you're getting constant, texts that obviously are going to 10,000 people, different world. But something like this that is specific is really heartwarming for people. Great. And then one other question is, will you be doing a session on the ACE Act and how it may or may not affect donor advised fund giving? Actually, yes. So donor advised fund gifts, big session on DAFs is definitely in our future. Please, if you haven't already, we'll wrap up here. Fill out the survey in Zoom. You've already done that for many of you. Thank you so much. Next session is on March 1, and we're going to talk about how women give and what are the sort of the differences in the data behind women's philanthropy versus a lot of the systems that have traditionally been built around men's philanthropy. And so how are people adapting to this world where women are becoming increasingly the majoritarian force in philanthropy? And what does that mean? And how do we have to rework some of the models that we've historically done? So that'll be really interesting. As usual, if you have anything you want to tell us or share or creative ideas, my email address is patrick@freewill. So that is it. Thank you so much for taking an hour with us. I know there's a lot of information. I know the recording and slides will be sent around. Also, by the way, someone asked about closed captioning earlier in the chat. It's very difficult for us to do that live, but the recordings will be closed captioned on YouTube, I believe. And so we're really trying to make it as accessible, and it's why we put a little bit more language on the slides, so it's easier to follow along if you're hearing impaired or maybe English isn't your dominant language. And I apologize, I tend to talk really fast, so I know that doesn't help with that. But for everybody, generally, huge thank you for joining. I really love that you all are pushing yourself, and hopefully we're helping you hit your goals this year, but also really helping you advance in your career on some of these really meaty topics that can be a little bit complex. So big thank you for joining. Really looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks if you're able to make it. And have a wonderful week. Happy Valentine's Day again. And thanks to all the hard work for the folks at FreeWill who are listening in and put a lot of effort into this session. So take care. Talk to you all soon and see you in a few weeks.